Aloha kako. Hello, everyone. My name is Rosemond Keanuenue Pettigrew, also known as Loke. I am deeply humbled by the invitation to open this year's National Week of Action in honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I am Kanako o Hawaii, a native of Hawaii, and a descendant of Hawa and Nalua'i on my mother's side, who were from Molokai. I was born and raised on the island of Oahu and moved to the island of Molokai 36 years ago to live on Aina Kupuna, land of my ancestors passed down through generations. Molokai has approximately 7,500 people, where 50% or more of the people identify as Hawaiian or part Hawaiian. I am fortunate to have raised my two children where our ancestors lived, worked, and protected the Aina. As a young mother, I stayed home with my youngest Keiki, or child, until she started school. Then I went out to take classes at the local community college while the children were in school. Since that time long ago, I have been employed by the State of Hawaii Judiciary, Second Circuit Family Court for 25 years as a social service assistant. Through my work with the court, I attend hearings on protection orders due to domestic violence, assisting the petitioners understand what options the court can provide to the women and their children for their safety. I am still employed in the family court working with families. In 2007, I applied for an on-call position as a domestic violence advocate at Hale Ho'omalu, House of Refuge, which is the DV shelter on Molokai, providing individual services, case management, safety planning, support groups, etc. Eventually, in 2018, I took on a part-time position as the shelter manager. It is now 14 years later, and I am still an advocate at the shelter and outside of the shelter. I am the board president of the Pohana o Nā Wahine, Pillars of Women. Our hui, or group, selected Pohana because, as our kupuna Nanife put it, the Pohana is the central wood pole used in traditional native Hawaiian homes, and without the Pohana, the house falls apart, and Wahine, or women, like Pohana, are the strength of the family. Pohana o Nā Wahine is dedicated to helping our people address domestic violence and other related injustices through a way of life rooted in our cultural beliefs and practices, through our voices, language, and teachings, and are securing resources towards this end. It is our mission to develop partnerships within our Hawaiian communities, local organizations, state, federal, and on a national level, to develop policies and cultural resources to stop and prevent gender-based violence in our communities and help victims, survivors, and their ohana, or family members, increase their safety. We are working to secure resources for a Native Hawaiian Resource Center on domestic violence to address the disparities in domestic violence throughout the state of Hawaii and in communities outside of Hawaii where there are Native Hawaiians. What I share with you now is my pahu, which means drum, and kahea, which means to call, cry out, invoke, summons. The pahu is an ancient instrument, and the sound of the pahu is referred to as leo, meaning voice, and the drumhead refers to as waha, meaning mouth. The power of the pahu is said to be sacred and has a voice which is appropriate as women are sacred and the foundation of family. Furthermore, the pahu's significance is it is the voice of those who are silenced. With our leo, we send out a loud kahea to call to action the powers that be to Native Hawaiians, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Indigenous peoples worldwide, all of our allies, our federal, state, tribal governments, and Native Hawaiian organizations and society at large to work with us to reform responses to murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, to restore Indigenous protections, and to prevent any more of our women and girls from going missing or murdered. With the Kahea, we call for an end to the stealing of our Indigenous women and girls. It is all of our kuleana, or responsibility, to uphold, support, and aid each other in putting an end to the murder and missing Indigenous women and girls in our homelands and around the world. Mahalo nui loa. A big thank you.
Hello, this is Juana Maho Dixon, and I'm calling you from my heart and reaching out to you with these words. Thank you. I want to thank our Native Hawaiian sister, Rosemont Pettigrew, or Loki as her family and friends call her, for that kahea. I thank you, Loki, for starting off our National Week of Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in a good way. As Indigenous peoples of our homelands, we live our lives every day honoring our ancestors and our future generations, especially our women who formed the backbone and lifeblood of our nations. Many Indigenous women and girls have experienced a spectrum of violence throughout their lifetimes. Today, Indigenous women and girls experience high rates of violence from the birth to death, unlike any other population in our country. This ongoing attack on our Indigenous women and girls is unacceptable. During this National Week of Action, we ask you to lock arms with us to call for cultural, political changes to strengthen federal, state, and tribal responses to the violence against Indigenous women, and urge the federal government to reaffirm and support Indigenous protective systems. Congress must do this now by reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, the Violence Prevention Service Act, with strong tribal enhancements this year. We cannot afford to wait any longer.
Thank you, Sister Dr. Juana Maho Dixon. My name is Shannon Hosey, and I'm the president of the Stafford Johnson community. I also serve as the co-chair of VAWA with Sister Juana. Long before the first National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls on May 5th, 2017, families and friends of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls spoke out against the failed responses from federal, state, and local governments and justice systems. The 2008 Restoration magazine covered the story of Victoria Engelman, whose mother, June Left Hand, reported her missing to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs ignored June's concerns and callously instead responded with, "Vicky's off partying, don't worry, she'll show up." Vicky ran off with a biker Sturgis. Grandparents, mothers, fathers, children gathered on horseback, on foot to find Victoria. They did the job of the FBI and the BIA with none of the federal resources at their disposal. After almost a month of searching the fields, riverbeds, family and friends, unfortunately found Victoria's body near a culvert on the Lower Brule Indian Reservation. Victoria Engelman's murder remains unsolved almost 15 years later. There are countless Indigenous women and girls with a story similar to Victoria. Jessica Lenahan, a Latina and Native American woman, sued the United States in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights after law enforcement refused to enforce the domestic violence protection orders against her ex-husband that abused her. The refusal led to her abuser kidnapping and killing her 3 daughters in 1999. Jessica sought justice at the U.S. Supreme Court, citing human rights violations for law enforcement's refusal to enforce domestic violence protection orders. While the United States Supreme Court dismissed Jessica's case, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights ruled in her favor. After the ruling, Jessica stated that, "I have waited 12 years for justice, knowing in my heart that the police inaction led to the tragic and untimely deaths of my 3 young daughters. Today's decisions tell the world that the government violated my human rights by failing to protect me and my children from domestic violence." Jessica's fight on the international stage supported what we have always known: safety for Indigenous women and children is a human right.
You know, when I heard what you said, one of the hardest things, President Hosley, and to all of you who are listening, was to know that Vicky's remains were taken to the coroner and they were sent back to her mother in a shoebox. And we brought that to a gathering of cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are preventable. Tribal nations, survivors, families, Indigenous leaders have spoken out against violence perpetrated against our women and girls since the first contact with the colonizers. Because of women like Victoria and Jessica, and our grassroots organizing groundswell against these injustices, federal lawmakers have slowly are coming to attention. Because of our calls to action, Congress has passed resolutions, Savannah's Act, the Not Invisible Act. What those laws are important as a step in the right direction, many gaps remain, including, listen to what I'm telling you, the lack of tribal jurisdiction over non-Indians that committed crimes against our women, children, elders, and tribal law enforcement. The gap in that is great. The lack of accountability for the law enforcement that failed to enforce tribal protection orders or investigating of cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women. The lack of resources for tribal domestic violence shelters and tribal victim services. The need to fully fund our tribal public safety and justice efforts as a part of the federal government's trust responsibilities and treaty agreements with tribal nations. Understanding that domestic and sexual violence serve as red flags for escalating violence. A national protocol for handling cases of missing and murder must be done. A national reporting system for missing and Native women and the institutionalization regarding for reports of missing Native women. Since 2017, the calls for justice from tribal nations, Indigenous folks, and the family of those that have gone missing have grown increasingly louder. Indigenous family and advocates in tribal nations continue to rise up to challenge the silence, the tolerance, and action by governments and responding to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Communities search and look for actions. Tribal press conferences, justice marches, candlelight vigils continue to draw the attention to the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. These local communities' actions reflect a long-standing call for the governments to hold the perpetrators of their crimes accountable. Indigenous-led grassroots actions are exposing the system barriers that run through the federal and local laws, policies, and institutions. The voices of the families, the advocates, Indigenous peoples, the tribal nations cannot and will not be silenced and ignored. Congress must act now to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act and Family Violence Prevention Service Act with strong tribal enhancements this year.
This year, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, the National Congress of American Indians, Indian Law Resource Center, Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence, Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, and the Poana Ona Wane have partnered to organize a national week of action that we launched today, April 29th through May 5th. We call on tribal nations, fellow Indigenous peoples, allies, governments, and the world to honor missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We encourage all individuals, governments, and organizations to actively participate in our virtual events and support events in your communities this week. Join us in saying, enough is enough, not one more stolen sister. This week, we reunite to urge the United States to reaffirm and support Indigenous proactive systems through our partnership's 6-point action plan. By 1, restoring tribal nation authority to protect American Indian and Alaska Native women by reauthorizing the Violence Against Women's Act with tribal enhancements to allow all tribal nations to prosecute non-Native Indians that attack Indigenous women, children, and elders. Number 2, recognizing and respecting Indigenous responses of Native Hawaiian communities and organizations to protect Indigenous women. And number 3, ensuring adequate resources for advocacy and services for Indigenous women by reauthorizing the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act with strong tribal enhancements and passing a permanent 10% set aside for tribal nations out of the Crime Victims Fund. Number 4, removing the systematic barriers facing the families of MMIWG, including support for the implementation of the Savannahs Act and the Not Invisible Act, and develop and pass additional MMIG legislation after engaging meaningful consultations. Number 5, implementing a thorough federal response to MMIGW by requiring every federal department to develop action plans with meaningful consultation to address MMIWG. And number 6, recognizing that both land and Indigenous women are sacred and connected, and that both require legislative and policy actions to protect them from extractive industries and corporate interest. Join us during our events this week to send a clear and strong-hearted message to all governments, individuals, and organizations that we will not accept any more of our Indigenous women and girls going missing or being murdered.